Imagine Siri no longer living somewhere inside your iPhone. You come home, say her name, and the device on the table literally turns toward you. The screen tilts, the camera understands where you are, Siri recognizes exactly who is speaking to her, and then continues the conversation as if there were not a speaker or a tablet in front of you, but a small physical digital assistant. Just a few years ago, an idea like this would have looked like a science fiction concept. But today, Apple is gradually assembling practically all the elements needed to create such a device. The company has already officially introduced a new generation of Siri AI that can understand a user's personal context, the content displayed on the screen, information from messages, emails, and photos, work with data from the internet, and perform actions inside applications. At the same time, Apple has been researching robotics for several years and, according to Bloomberg sources, is developing a tabletop home robot with a display mounted on a movable mechanical arm. So today, we are going to examine what could become one of Apple's most unusual future products, a device that could essentially serve as a physical body for Siri. And the most interesting part is that Apple may not need to create a humanoid robot for this at all. The company may not need legs, arms, a face, or a complete body. It may be enough to make Siri capable of looking at a person, moving, hearing them, understanding the surrounding environment, and responding not only with her voice, but also through physical movement. That is when an ordinary voice assistant begins to be perceived in a completely different way. First, it is important to separate confirmed facts from information about devices that are still under development. In June 2026, Apple officially introduced Siri AI. This is no longer the old Siri, which primarily handled commands such as setting a timer or playing music. Apple says the new Siri is built around the next generation of Apple intelligence and has gained an understanding of personal context, world knowledge, the ability to work with information displayed on the screen, and deeper integration with the operating system. It can search for relevant information across the user's messages, email, photos, and other personal data, answer questions using information from the internet, and interact with applications through system-level actions. Apple has even created a dedicated app for Siri where users can return to previous conversations. All of this is extremely important in the context of a home robot, because whereas in the past putting Siri onto a moving display would not have been particularly interesting, Apple now has a much more intelligent foundation that could potentially support extended conversations and understand what is happening in a person's digital life. At the same time, the physical part of this story is beginning to emerge. According to Bloomberg, Apple is working on a family of home devices in which the new Siri is expected to play a central role. The first stage is reportedly a home hub, referred to in reports under the codename J490. It is said to feature a roughly 7-inch square display, support for video calls, facial recognition, smart home control, music playback, and Siri as its central interface. But the next project is considerably more interesting. Apple is also developing a larger display mounted on a robotic arm, and this device could represent the real transition from ordinary Siri to a physical assistant. The screen would be able to change its position in space and turn toward the user. Earlier reports about the project mentioned the ability to tilt the display up and down and rotate it by approximately 360 degrees. In other words, this is effectively not just an iPad on a stand, but a mechanical structure capable of responding to a person through movement. And this is where the most interesting part begins. Because movement itself may seem like a minor detail, what difference does it make whether the display automatically turns toward you or you simply place an iPad on a table? But Apple's own research suggests that the difference could be enormous. In January 2025, Apple researchers published a study called Elon, focused on expressive movement in non-anthropomorphic robots. For the experiments, Apple built a device resembling a desk lamp with movable segments. The researchers studied how a robot could express attention, intention, and even a certain emotional state using nothing but movement. The results showed that expressive movements noticeably increased people's engagement and strengthened the feeling that they were interacting with something more than just a mechanism. The effect was particularly strong in social interaction scenarios. In other words, Apple itself is experimentally testing the idea that a device does not necessarily need a human face to appear alive. Sometimes the way it tilts, turns, and reacts is enough. For example, imagine that Siri hears a question from someone sitting at the kitchen table. Instead of simply responding with audio, the device smoothly turns toward the person. The screen tilts slightly. The Siri interface appears facing the user. If the person moves around the room, the camera and sensors continue tracking their position, and the display follows them. If another family member joins the conversation, the device can turn toward them instead. Even without a face or eyes, the human brain automatically begins interpreting such movements as signs of attention. We constantly use similar signals in everyday life. A person turns their head when listening to someone. They lean closer when they want to show interest. They look away or change their body position. These are precisely the mechanisms Apple is attempting to transfer to robotic devices. And that is why the concept of a physical Siri is actually much deeper than it may initially appear. Apple has also researched expressive movement for more sophisticated robots. In another study published by the company Emotion, researchers used large language models to generate natural gestures and robot movements, depending on the context of the interaction. The system was designed to select appropriate nonverbal responses so that the robot could communicate with people through more than just words. In some tests, the movements generated in this way were rated as comparable to, or even more understandable than, movements designed by humans. Of course, these are research projects, not confirmation that these exact algorithms will appear in a commercial Apple device. But the direction is extremely revealing. The company is simultaneously developing an intelligent Siri, robotic movement, and methods for making robots socially understandable to humans. And when these directions are combined, it becomes clear why a tabletop robot could become one of Apple's most logical next products. What is particularly interesting is that a physical Siri could potentially make use of practically the entire existing Apple ecosystem. Imagine the morning. The device recognizes the user, turns toward them, and displays a personalized interface. Siri tells you the weather, shows your upcoming appointments, reminds you about an email you wanted to send yesterday, displays the route to your first meeting, and suggests playing some music. All of this is already a natural extension of the capabilities of Siri AI, which has gained access to personal context and applications. Then, the user sits down for breakfast, and the display automatically changes its position so that it is comfortable to see. A FaceTime call begins, and the device continues keeping the person in frame. If they move to another part of the kitchen, the display can rotate to follow them. And this is where it becomes clear why Apple needs a robotic arm in the first place. It transforms the display from a stationary object into a device that can autonomously adapt to the person. The second major scenario is the smart home. Today, smart home control is distributed among phones, speakers, watches, and various control panels. Physical Siri could become a kind of central control hub for the entire home. The user says, "Make it a little cooler in here," and Siri adjusts the temperature. They ask to see who is standing at the front door, and the screen turns toward them and displays the camera feed. They ask to turn off the lights in the children's room, close the blinds, and activate the alarm system. If the device can recognize faces, it could potentially show different information to different family members. A child could see their school schedule, one adult could see their work calendar, and another could see a task list or notifications. Bloomberg has linked Apple's home strategy not only to the robot and home hub, but also to a broader focus on home security. Therefore, such a device could become the central interface connecting cameras, locks, sensors, and HomeKit into a single system. There is also a third scenario that could make the device far more important than an ordinary smart speaker. It could become a personal computer that is always nearby but does not require constant physical interaction. On an iPhone or Mac, a person has to look at the screen and interact with the interface. Physical Siri could potentially operate in a much more natural way. You could be preparing food and say, "Show me the next step of the recipe." The device turns toward you. A few minutes later, you move to another part of the kitchen, and the screen changes its angle. You say, "Add milk to the shopping list," and then continue cooking. Then you ask it to call someone on FaceTime, start a timer, and at the same time tell you when your meeting begins. None of these functions is revolutionary on its own. But when the interface is constantly physically adapting to the user, the interaction becomes less like working with a computer and more like having a conversation with an assistant. That is precisely why Apple may try to make the device's defining feature not its technical specifications, but its presence. Today, HomePod can hear you, an iPhone can see you through its camera, a Mac displays information, Apple Watch knows what is on your wrist, Vision Pro understands your gaze direction and the surrounding environment. But none of these devices physically expresses attention. A robotic Siri could become Apple's first device that literally shows, "I heard you." It turns toward you. The screen moves closer. It changes its angle. It may use Siri's animations and sound simultaneously with the movement of the body. These are small details, but they could create an entirely new type of emotional connection with technology. There is another important point. Historically, Apple has rarely been the first company to create a new category. The company did not invent the smartphone, MP3 player, tablet, smartwatch, or virtual reality headset. But Apple has repeatedly taken existing ideas and turned them into products that are easy for mainstream users to understand. The same thing could happen with home robots. Experimental home robots already exist, as do displays with automatic user tracking and smart speakers with screens. However, most of these products still feel either like gadgets for enthusiasts or like cameras mounted on stands. Apple could potentially try to transform this category into an emotionally understandable object that feels like part of the home rather than a laboratory robot. And this is where design becomes critically important. If such a device actually reaches the market, Apple will probably not make it look like an industrial robotic arm. The company will likely try to conceal the mechanical components as much as possible. Smooth aluminum, a minimal number of visible joints, rounded edges, an iPad-style display, quiet electric motors, and extremely smooth movements. Perhaps the robotic arm will move more slowly than it technically could simply so that its movements feel calm and safe. Apple's research itself shows that the speed, trajectory, and character of movement can change how people perceive a robot. The same turn can be performed abruptly and mechanically, or smoothly with a slight pause, creating an entirely different impression. The screen will probably become Siri's main visual face. Apple already uses glowing interfaces and animations to indicate when its voice assistant is active, and a physical device opens the possibility of taking this idea much further. When Siri is listening, the interface could respond to the user's voice. When she is thinking, the animation could change. When she is talking to a specific person, the screen and body could be directed specifically toward them. Apple may not even need to draw human eyes or a face. A more abstract visual representation of Siri could look much more modern and avoid the strange effect that often appears with robots that are too human-like. Cameras will play an equally important role. They are needed not only for FaceTime. For the display to automatically orient itself toward the user, the system needs to understand the geometry of the room, locate people, and determine who is currently speaking. A home device may require wide-angle cameras and various depth or distance sensors. Apple already has enormous experience in computer vision thanks to the iPhone, Face ID, Vision Pro, and visual intelligence. Therefore, the company would not have to develop many of the technologies required for visual perception of space from scratch. The real question is how far Apple will allow a home device to continuously analyze its surroundings. And this brings us to the most difficult topic of all: privacy. The more useful physical Siri becomes, the more information she could potentially access. To understand who is in the room, the device needs to use cameras and microphones. To be truly personal, Siri needs access to messages, calendars, photos, email, and other data. Apple is building its new Apple Intelligence architecture with a strong emphasis on privacy, using both on-device processing and private cloud compute for more demanding workloads. With the new Siri, the company has specifically emphasized the protection of personal information. For a home robot, this could become one of its biggest competitive advantages. People will be much more willing to place an always-on camera in their living room if they are confident that most of the analysis happens locally and that the system does not turn into a surveillance device. At the same time, the computing platform inside such a robot could be significantly more powerful than that of an ordinary HomePod. modern Siri AI uses the third-generation Apple Foundation models family. Apple officially describes models that run directly on the device, as well as server-side models within private cloud compute. One of the local models, AFM3 Core Advanced, is multimodal, meaning that it can work with several different types of information at the same time. For a physical robot, multimodality is especially important. It needs to hear speech, understand the camera image, take the user's actions into account, navigate context, and formulate a response simultaneously. That is why a tabletop robot could become one of the most natural devices for demonstrating the capabilities of Apple Intelligence. This is where the strategic reason for Apple potentially investing enormous amounts of money in the project emerges. In recent years, one of the biggest problems facing many consumer electronics manufacturers has been that smartphones have become too good. People replace them less frequently, while each new generation is becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from the previous one. Apple is constantly looking for the next major device category. The company has already expanded into wearable electronics, smartwatches, headphones, and spatial computers. A robotic home assistant could open up an entirely new category in which Apple would not simply be selling another screen, but a new way of interacting with artificial intelligence. If the project succeeds, it could become for Siri what the iPhone once became for the mobile internet. Before the iPhone, the internet already existed on mobile phones, but users experienced it in a completely different way. In a similar way, voice assistants have existed for many years, yet most people use them for only a few simple commands. A physical robot could change the way people perceive an assistant itself. When the device is in the room, looks at you, understands the context, can display information, and physically responds to the conversation, people may begin interacting with it much more frequently. And then Siri stops being a function of the operating system and becomes a standalone product. This could also significantly change Apple's position in the artificial intelligence race. Google, OpenAI, Amazon, and other companies compete primarily at the level of models and software assistants. But Apple has an advantage that most AI developers do not: its enormous proprietary hardware ecosystem. If the company can combine the iPhone, Mac, Watch, AirPods, Vision Pro, home cameras, smart home systems, and physical Siri into a unified system, the assistant could remain practically constantly present alongside the user. You could start a conversation with Siri on your iPhone in the car, arrive home, and the home robot could potentially continue the same context. You could ask it to do something in the evening, and the next morning the device could remind you about it. This kind of deep integration between hardware and software intelligence has always been one of Apple's greatest strengths. On the other hand, creating such a device would be extremely difficult. Even a simple robotic arm needs to operate for tens of thousands of hours without noticeable wear, move almost silently, and remain safe at the same time. Imagine the mechanism rotating hundreds of times every day. After several years, the joints must not begin to squeak or develop play. The cables running inside the structure to the display must withstand an enormous number of movement cycles. The motors must not overheat. The device must detect if a child grabs the display with their hand and immediately stop moving. All of this turns what appears to be a simple product into an extremely complex mechanical system. There is also the question of price. Early reports about the project suggested that Apple was considering a device significantly more expensive than an ordinary smart speaker. The exact commercial price of a future robot has not been confirmed, and the project could still change substantially. But it is obvious that a display, high-quality cameras, a powerful processor, several electric motors, and a mechanical structure will cost considerably more than a HomePod. Therefore, the first generation could turn out to be more of a premium experiment than a mass-market device. For Apple, that would not necessarily be a problem. The company has already used a similar strategy with the Apple Watch, Vision Pro, and other new product categories, gradually improving the technology while reducing the cost of individual components. The question of necessity is no less important. A skeptic could quite reasonably ask, Why do you need a display on a motorized arm if you can simply use an iPhone or put an iPad in the kitchen? This is precisely the question Apple will have to answer convincingly. People will not buy a robot simply because it can turn toward them. The device needs to make everyday activities noticeably more convenient. Perhaps its decisive advantage will be the combination of several functions: a central smart home display, a FaceTime camera, a smart speaker, a personal assistant, a security camera, and an Apple Intelligence device. In that case, the robot would stop looking like an expensive toy and start replacing several different gadgets at once. Perhaps in a few years we will look back at today's Siri in much the same way we now look back at the first button-based mobile phones with mobile internet. It was already capable of doing a lot, but it lacked the right form. Physical Siri could become that form. The screen would become her face, the cameras would become her eyes, the microphones would become her ears, the speakers would become her voice. The robotic structure would give her movement. Apple Intelligence would give her an understanding of context, and the Apple ecosystem would provide access to the user's digital life. And then what we would have in front of us would no longer be simply a new HomePod, not just an iPad on a stand, and not even an ordinary home robot. It could be Apple's first step toward a world in which artificial intelligence stops being software that we launch and becomes a physical device that is constantly present alongside us.